The second stage of social movement is called coalescence, also called micromobilization. This is when people start to organize, when the movement starts to have leaders, starts to develop resource gathering capabilities, and begins to publicize and raise awareness for the issue. This is when the momentum of a movement should begin to pick up, and if it's successful, it'll lead to institutionalization. In the non-nuclear weapon movement, here's some of the important events that happened during the coalescence stage. First, there's the Bikini Atoll incident, then the death of Sasaki Sadako, followed by the Shimoda et al. Versus the state case. And I'll go into each of these in more detail. So first up is Bikini Atoll. After that event, the widespread fear of radiation helped each individual to see themselves as potential hibakusha. And so grassroots campaigns began to form protesting ANH bombs and started to get actual results. One of those grassroots campaigns was a housewives' book reading club that later became Gensuikyo, which we'll actually talk about later in institutionalization. The annual World Conference Against Atomic and Hydrogen Bombs was also created the following year, and policymakers started to take notice, leading to the growth of the international movement against nuclear weapons. In 1955 was the death of Sasaki Sadako, a young girl who had been exposed to nuclear radiation at the age of 2 in the atomic bombing. According to an ancient Japanese belief, folding 1,000 paper cranes would help in her recovery, so she set out to fold them in her bed, in her hospital bed, but only reached 964 before she died in 1955. Her story and paper cranes both became symbols of the injustice of the nuclear bombs and helped to frame the non-nuclear weapon movement's case in an emotional way. Around the same time, Okamoto Shoichi, a Japanese lawyer, had begun to pursue a legal struggle to bring justice to A-bomb survivors. After being rejected by American courts, he brought this case, Shimoda et al. Versus the state, to Japanese courts in 1955. And while the case didn't succeed in bringing justice to the victims, it brought public attention to the movement. And eventually, the judge's decision in 1963, ruling that the nuclear weapon usage was against international law, gave the non-nuclear weapon movement a moral high ground. So those are some examples of how a movement might succeed in the coalescence stage. A movement that fails to coalesce might lose some public support if it loses momentum. And this is what happens to most movements. They kind of fail to keep momentum up and they die out in this stage. So what are the important factors in distinguishing successes and failures? Movements are more likely to succeed in this stage if they're able to take advantage of a strong communication network, or if they have strong charismatic leaders who are able to clearly and effectively frame the movement's goals. Think of Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi for their respective movements. This framing of a movement is closely related to many marketing concepts, which is kind of interesting, and we'll explore that later. Optimism and clarity of goals are also important, as well as something called frame alignment, which we'll talk about in a bit as well. So to illustrate these points, one example of a successful case is the white paper protests in China of 2022. So in 2022, young people protested the government's strict zero COVID policies after a series of deadly accidents. And those protests would come to be called the white paper protests because of the protesters' use of a blank white sheet of paper to symbolize their inability to criticize the government. University students also played a large role, taking to social networks outside of the Chinese government's control in order to track police and form clusters to continue protesting. So this movement succeeded in part because of its ability to form a strong communication network despite government suppression, as well as their ability to frame their message in a clear, clever, and symbolic way. Another successful example is the 30-meter telescope protests in Hawaii, a protest against the construction of the 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea, a sacred Hawaiian mountain. Again, traditional marketing tactics to garner support came into play here, with notable celebrities like The Rock and Jason Momoa supporting the movement. Adding to that, opposing the construction of a telescope on a sacred mountain is a pretty clear and simple goal, which made the movement easy to get behind. And then there's frame alignment. Hawaiian sovereignty was already a popular movement in Hawaii with similar goals. So, because those two frames were aligned, the movement was able to easily gain support from supporters of that movement and utilize the structure of existing organizations. So those three factors combined help make this movement successful. So these are some of the factors in determining whether a movement makes it through the coalescence stage. If it's successful, a movement will move on to institutionalization.